original. And we were talking about how there probably was no original manuscript of the whole Bible or of the whole Bible at one time because it was crafted over, 800, 900 years. So the early parts didn't wait for the other parts to be written before you start having different manuscripts existing. I know that's a little confusing, but hopefully that makes sense. So we may not have had one original manuscript. So, but that's getting a little far off. The inerrancy argument, you go back to the original, but even that's a little bit fallacy to a point. There's a fallacy there because what's the original? So it's nice to say that. So you could say the original of each book, the original of each collection, that type of thing. But I would say there's a lot of churches when they're talking about it, they're talking about James or Joe said, back to the original, whatever.
So they would think the hand of God was in that translation.
Yeah. And the King James, they would think the hand of God was in original manuscripts, and then we got things messed up.
There is one thing of King James onlyism that recognizes discrepancies between the King James and the original manuscripts that were available at the time, because Erasmus back translated from Latin the end of Romans. I'm sorry, the end of Revelation.
All right, yeah.
And so they recognize that issue. So what they say is that God controlled the minds of the King James translators and made the perfect God intended Bible in English now as the pure and perfect, even better than the Greek and the Hebrew. There's that.
Okay.
Joe, who said that?
That's some of the things written by what I'll call extreme King James only is post 2000.
Okay.
There's something now.
Some of the newest writers. That God superintended the writing in James English as a pure and unadulterated word of God.
Right.
How do we, well, it'll pop up. All right, yeah, nothing else.
Hey, Dave, it's been a couple of years since I read his book, Greg Boyd,
Yeah.
who is he's a scholar, in today's world. He wrote that book about, well, we talked about it because I was reading it. It's not that the Bible is inerrant, but it's intentional. Do you remember him saying that? I thought that was an interesting way to put it. It's not inerrant, but it's intentional.
Yeah, I think I would agree with that. Because inerrant means well, there's no error, so it one definition will be it comes from God, and there's not much human input to there. Where again in grad school we had we were talking about this, and the professor was very clear. This Bible was written by humans. That was non-negotiable, and there was someone in the class who kept going back and forth with me. For Herb Hoffman, it was non-negotiable, and I think it is for me. So we say it was written by humans, it was inspired intentionally by God, but how we define what inspired means, that's really up for grabs. How did God inspire the original authors to write what they wrote?
And it was a collection of humans.
Yeah, it just wasn't one person, so it was a collection of humans. So we throw that inspired in there to give the Bible authoritative status and to I had a word, I lost it, but just to to say that God was involved in the process somehow, just like communion. Catholics believe in transubstantiation, which means when the priest blesses the communion, it actually becomes the body and the blood of Christ. Lutherans or others, for example, will believe in co-substantiation, which means it's both and in some miraculous way. The Anabaptists and the Brethren, we make no bones, it's grape juice and it's bread, but it's a symbol. So John Dernball called that commemoration. So you get transubstantiation, consubstantiation, and commemoration. So you have different views. So you're going to have different views of what inspiration in the Bible actually. How was it inspired? So, we can talk about that till the cows come home. Everyone's going to have a different answer. Yeah.
Well, intentional and inerrant are have two different meanings.
That's my point. That's the point I was just making.
And that's what he meant too.
Yeah. So intentional would mean people sat down and wrote it intentionally as scripture. God was involved somehow in the process, but it wasn't necessarily inerrant because we can come up with all kinds of errors. When one manuscript was copied to another manuscript, they didn't have the technology we have now. They had to copy it hand by hand. So we can actually compare some manuscripts. Because when they were supposed to, when a manuscript got defective, they would copy it to another and throw it out. They didn't always throw it out, it was hidden. So then we archaeologists found the older manuscripts, and so they compare them. And so someone's writing, let's say you have to copy a whole page, and there's a word here, there's a word down here. You might, and it's the same word, you might be writing here, look away, then you should get down to this word. So we have paragraphs in manuscripts that are missing because of, and they have a whole list of what they call copyist errors. Whereas you're copying, you make certain errors. Another one would be letters that look differently. So when you're dealing with the Hebrew alphabet, this is you would pronounce that D. This letter, you would pronounce R. Well, sometimes someone wants to write this and they write that. They want to write, this is called the Dalet, this is called the Resh. And then there's some other letters. There's this, which is an H. And then there's this, where that's closed. That means CH, or that's how you pronounce it. So this will be ha, this will be, but they're two different letters. They're two different letters. And there's all kinds of copyist errors when you're trying. So down through history, errors have cropped in. So then, once we know that, the Bible isn't inerrant. It was created over time, written by humans, inspired by God, and then that's about as far as I can take it. Then we just deal with what we got.
Is there like I don't want to make sense to me, but is there any school of thought that believes there is like one pure manuscript that's just been lost that we've never seen, like the original? Because we know there is no one copy that was handed straight to Adam or anybody, right? Like, does anybody believe that? We just haven't found it.
I think some might believe that, but as I just said, as we look at how the Bible was written, and if we understand that correctly, it's almost impossible to have had one manuscript. Because by the time you get to things being written later, there's already different manuscripts of the earlier material. So, I do think people, it's just me talking about this, it gets complicated. So there would be a school of thought might go that way, Jake, when they don't wanna deal with all this. I mean, you almost have to have a PhD to really get a handle on this, and most people don't wanna do that. So how easy is it to say the Bible's inerrant? God wrote it, told people he dictated to people to write it down. That's good enough for me. It's so easy to say that, but it's much messier than that. You know that from what I've been teaching you. Allie?
So for people that think that the Bible is like inerrant and God wrote it directly, what's their reasoning for like, why did he wait so long? Like Adam and Eve didn't have the Bible, like what's their logic for that, that like he waited until?
Good writing. Right.
It's not, but.
Go to Chickies and ask.
They had to invent, they had to
Well-
an outlet.
Yeah, I don't know if they have I don't really, I'm not an expert in that kind of thinking, but, whenever it started to be written down, but
Right, but like, couldn't it have been like a verbal Bible? Like, why, I'm just curious, I do probably don't know the answer, I just am curious, like the logic behind that.
well, number one, they're not gonna buy that from what a number of us say that it took a long process. They're gonna look at the Bible itself, and then they're gonna go backwards. And they're gonna say, hey, the world is only 4,000 years old. And then they'll probably say, well, some people say that Moses wrote the first 5 books. So the Bible would have been written much earlier. I look at the first 5 books of the Bible and I read them carefully, and I say, there's no way that one person wrote these 5 books. And that's a whole nother discussion. We probably talked about that earlier on. But there's no way that, in my opinion, and I'm getting pretty forthright here, there's no way that Moses could have written the first 5. It's just impossible.
Well, that's what I was.
But
Yeah.
it makes sense, and then Jesus did say the books of Moses, so there are reasons why people believe that. But then when you get behind the scenes, you really look at it. So hopefully that answers some of your questions,
Yeah.
not all of it.
Well, I don't want to belabor this, but the churches of the Brethren who have left the Church of the Brethren are just churches.
Yeah,
Do they believe that the Bible is inerrant? Do they
Part of the split was the inerrancy issue. Part of it, not everybody, certainly Chickies was.
yeah.
Yeah.
Well, some do. I mean, the way to answer that question is, it's not a simple, when you say people who left, people have left for many, many reasons. And we don't, as you said, we don't want to belabor that. But here's the thing. We talk about inerrancy. And what we're really talking about this is what we're talking about. Biblical authority. So if we go back to the 1983 paper in sexuality, in 1979, we passed a paper in a conference on biblical authority. And I mentioned this a couple of weeks ago, and it was in columns because there are churches and people in the Church of the Brethren who believe the Bible is inerrant. And then there are other people who believe the Bible is inspired by God, but requires interpretation. So when it came to that in the paper, they had two columns. One column had the inerrancy view, and the other column had the Bible is inspired, requires interpretation view. And then you have people moving along that continuum sometimes in the church. Luckily, I've always been in a church where people were not of one mind on inerrancy, biblical authority, any hot button issue you talk about. And it was the love of the church that held it together. They were fine to agree to disagree. That wasn't any problem. They understood it wasn't all that simple. Even the people who were more on the inerrant end. So I was blessed to have two long-term pastors where we were able to talk about some of these things and not tear people's eyes out or hair out or whatever, not go out and duke it out in the parking lot.
We use a word here at E-Town, forbearance, that I felt where we were before,
Yes.
had really gotten lost. Where if you didn't believe like I believe, you are wrong and that's that. And here, we are allowed to agree to disagree and not all feel exactly the same way and still love each other the same. And,
Forbearance, tolerance, and we have a paper at annual conference that talks about that. The Church of the Brethren is a church that is forbearant and tolerant. And that passed the body, but there were others, and some of those churches have left recently. We had some people leave in 2017 on, and some of you know about those churches. And forbearance and tolerance was very challenging for them, and they got to a point where, no, because forbearance and tolerance can imply anything goes. And that's where, they draw the line. Well, no, it doesn't imply anything goes. In my theology and my teaching, anything doesn't go. But it has to make sense. And then you go from there.
So if you take the Bible literally.
Yeah.
Do you have to cut off your right hand if it offends you, and do you have to pluck out your eye? Like I have eye issues when I need to pluck out my eye.
Yeah, well, that's the challenge when you take the Bible inerrantly, and then, I'm sure the people who believe the Bible's inerrant, they have answers to all these things, and I can't tell you what their answer to that would be, and maybe we don't need to really uncover that specific, but they don't cut their hand off. And there's a passage that talks about if you have a rebellious child, you take that child out in front of the community and you throw the first stone, and you stone that child to death. We don't do that. I don't know anybody.
However, my husband had a patient that literally did cut his arm off for that reason.
Oh, my goodness.
Okay, it will happen. Yeah, well, and there, as Sandy just mentioned, there were some mental health issues there, you can imagine. But, yeah, Jim and then Craig.
Rick, thanks. You triggered my memory. I thought, gee, it may be worth sharing. From about 79, thereabouts, 78 through the 80s, Earl Fike was our senior pastor.
Yeah.
And often in his sermons, his word was forbearance, forbearance. But Earl also used a phrase I know as a sermon illustration, and he used it more than once, and it stuck with me. It helped me in life. You may be right. We're having a discussion. Well, it doesn't mean you're wrong and I'm right, or I'm wrong and you're right. You may be right, and that helped me. To forbearance. When annual conference was in Pittsburgh, and I think it was somewhere around 2000. Earl was one of the preachers for the worship service, and of course, the sexuality issue that was going on. At that time, he preached on forbearance. And remember, my wife and I, wonderful sermon. Makes a lot of sense.
Sure.
Two ladies in back of us after the worship service were quick to stand up. That's the worst sermon I ever heard.
Come on.
Yeah. He didn't get through to them.
Wow.
No, we have that in annual conference, and there was well, we don't have it as much now, maybe. There was a time when we were able to disagree. We were able to agree to disagree, and then, in 2011, we reaffirmed the earlier paper on human sexuality, which I call the 1983 paper, and, which really we should now call the 2011 paper. Because it affirmed the 19, it hadn't updated it, so, I lost it.
I thought you lost it.
Train
Might
derailed.
even help any probably.
Now, where was I going with that? Help me out.
From the 83 paper, the 2011 paper,
Where was I going?
to Craig. I could tell by the look on his
Yeah.
face.
I don't know what you.
All right, well, we'll just let that go. Craig, you had your hand up.
Well, if you want a stunning example of how far people can go to explain their inerrant thinking, go to Dayton, Ohio and turn left and drop down about 20 miles. Noah's Ark is there.
Okay.
And it's.
You're right.
And those two ladies that Jim Hopper talked about in the conference were there when we were. And I was just going through that thing, shaking my head based on all the science I've understood over the decades. And these two little ladies were looking at these displays and saying, well, now I understand how this works. So I encourage you to do that, just to learn how far out these things are.
Actually, you don't turn left, you turn right.
Not for Dayton.
I worked with a man that had went to the Ark experience.
Yeah.
He came back and he was explaining how they had, oh yeah, they had this and they had that, and that's how they dealt with this and that, and I'm like, oh my word, how did they, somebody just made this. It doesn't explain any of that in the Bible, I mean, you guys, this is how you're justifying this stuff in your head.
Well,
Like, oh my.
But they did put some thought into
They
it,
did.
trying to reconcile, what they came up with the biblical
He
text.
was just talking about like, I mean, how they would have dealt with the manure, that kind of stuff.
Sure.
They had to, and like, how would anybody know that?
Well, they just,
But where we came from, there was also dinosaurs on the ark, and then they said that they had heard a podcast that said they were baby dinosaurs. And
right,
that's how they would have been a lot easier to have dinosaurs in the ark.
okay. Now, that's important, and that might be able to move us in another direction, but that is, this is what happens with inerrancy. There are ways, people find ways. I mean, you've heard it said, we can make the Bible say anything we want it to say,
Well,
so.
they went off of the great beast, it says great beast, and they said, well, that's what I would call a great beast, is a dinosaur. Well, an elephant would be a pretty great beast, in
So,
my opinion.
so when we come to things in the Bible that make absolutely no sense, no common sense, then we find ways to explain it, and that's a good example. Okay, you build this ark, and okay, there's problems with manure, there's problems with ventilation, whatever, they find
a
some.
solution, yeah.
Yeah, there's a solution to it all.
David Sandy had a comment earlier.
Oh, I think last week you said something about that it's a healthy thing to have diverse ideas in a congregation.
I've always thought so, yeah.
Well, and I remember Andy Murray preaching at annual conference, and that was one of his big points, because we were in the middle of a big conflict.
We were, yeah.
And it always stuck with me.
Yeah, I think diversity is helpful, but we're moving away from that. Some of us are. A lot of people are in trouble with the politics right now, and it just isn't one side. Now, I'm not gonna say too much, but I feel one way about the politics, and then I hear the other side saying almost the same thing that I'm saying. So I think diversity is helpful and we're starting to get away from it. When we become polarized, then we're no longer diverse, but to have diversity and to agree to disagree and to actually listen instead of just saying, putting up a wall. You know, we are diverse people. We come from different backgrounds. Even my siblings were diverse. And if love holds out, then we're okay. But if we start putting up walls and start drawing lines in the sand, then we have trouble in our family. So far we okay. George.
In this process, I keep thinking of how this church or how I deal with an issue. And it comes down to how did people, did they have consensus? Or did they say 2/3 of you raise your hand? And if 2/3 is the guideline, then it's put down. Rather than individual. And that's a hard one. Meaning that a group like this says, if 2/3 of us believe this, that's what it's gonna be.
Well, George, we've done that as a congregation already.
Oh, I know.
And that has led to some diversity that was not tolerable for some people.
Yeah, right, yeah.
Well, and then when it gets to that point, we or they have to make the decision.
Exactly.
And they have.
And you know, that's great sadness.
Yeah, it can be.
But sometimes that 2/3 vote is what makes the decision.
Yeah, because the paper on forbearance, the paper on biblical authority, you know, and some of these papers, and I won't get into it, require a simple majority. So if it's, some of these papers, if they're dealing with policy, will require a 2/3 majority. So that's, if we're following Robert's Rules of Order, that's where we're going to go. And so we take a vote. If the vote's affirmative or whatever, the paper passes. Right? And it's declined. There was an amendment, well, I won't get into that. That's.
I'm on district board, most of you know. And when a church writes us and says they wish to withdraw, there is a process. And the first step of the process is that some elders, and I can give you some of these names, I know them, go to that congregation, to the board, and talk about what can we do to resolve this. So the first thing they try to do is forbearance. The first thing they try to do is keep that church in the Church of the Brother. And after all else fails, and then the last step, after all the legal stuff, is the board has to vote to, I forget the word, to cut them off, whatever it is. And every time before that vote, Pete Contra leads us in conversation of grief and sadness. And we have a prayer of repentance and grief and sadness. I think that's really, and blessing for the congregation that's leaving. I think that's really significant.
But when that congregation does leave, they're not 100% on board, all of them. So there's conflict within the congregation. And then some may have to separate. I mean, you know the pain of separation. It's hard.
Yep. Okay, let's get to a thought for thought translation. You know, sometimes we, and I've said this before, sometimes we get off of what we might intend to cover.
But it's good stuff.
But these discussions are helpful because we're all struggling with some of the same things. And you can tell by someone says this and someone says this and you build off. So, and you're not frustrated with the conversation, these conversations, or else you wouldn't be coming back, right? you find these help. But we do try to stick with
We
the
have
handouts.
forbearance.
Huh?
We have forbearance.
You have forbearance. Well, one thing that makes this class work is that we don't have any time frame really. Like, if I was teaching this, the different Bible translations, and I had 6 weeks to do it, then I would have to, I wouldn't be able to allow these discussions. But because, these are, and I think these are very important discussions. That's why we have them. Okay, you know what a word for word translation is pretty much. Now, what is a thought for thought translation? And I'll be reading somewhat from your handout. But there's translation theory, and some people call thought for thought translation a dynamic equivalence translation. Well, that's dynamic equivalence is just a technical word in translation theory, which basically means you're translating an equivalent message, an equivalent thought, an equivalent phrase from the original language to the target language. So it's a sophisticated technical way of saying thought for thought translation. So I have dynamic equivalence because you may come upon that word at time and from time to time. And if you do, for me, simplistically, that just basically means thought for thought translation. So what is a thought for thought translation? You basically take a sentence or a phrase from the ancient languages and you render the meaning of this sentence or phrase in the modern or the target language as close as possible. Where word for word, we're trying to preserve some of the word order and the grammar of the original language. Here, we don't get too bogged down with that. You have to translate it word for word first, then you try to smooth it out into a thought. You're just translating, okay, this phrase, we'll do it word for word. Let's say this phrase, she was found to have in her womb, okay, and we do this word for word as well, thought for thought, she was pregnant. And that is a thought for thought translation, but we'll get into that a little bit more. The goal is to translate the meaning of each thought, and as a result, you have a looser and a freer translation. So again, the emphasis is not so much on the word order or the grammar of the ancient languages, but it's rather an attempt to express in translation the concept that's being conveyed in the original language, the message. Any questions about thought for thought translation?
I'm looking at your example. And,
Well, before we get there,
okay,
just the whole notion of a thought for thought. Now, what are the advantages? It's easier to read. It's easier to understand. It eliminates that choppy, awkward wording of a word for word translation. And so it will take a word for word thought and smooth it out in readable English. And thought for thought translation will also use modern day idioms and modern day phrases to render the translation. So you're not stuck in ancient language idioms, or you're not stuck in Elizabethan language of a previous translation. You're trying to use the modern phrases as much as possible. So we don't have these and nows anymore. We have you and your, right? That kind of thing. So that's
It occurs to me that in this type of translation, there's gonna be more influence from the culture and world in which we're living, because we'll choose thoughts that are part of our world. And 200 years ago, they there would probably be some differences
Yeah.
in how things were translated. I don't know if that fits under advantage or disadvantage or maybe both, but
Could be both, because, one goal of a word for word translation, and I haven't hit on that as much as possible, but you are trying to preserve the culture in which that language was, written, and the meanings of the words at that time, where a particular word might have a different meaning 2,000 years later. So, I think it's definitely an advantage for people who are looking for a translation that they can understand better and aren't perhaps as concerned on the original languages, because there's some sense of, when you talk about the Greek and the Hebrew, to be proficient in that, and I know this from personal experience, you have to spend a lot of time to do that. And people who put this New Testament together, these are, they've poured over a number of manuscripts, and then they put them together to what makes sense, and they rule this one out and they put this one in. And so, in some sense, there's a trust in that. Okay, they've done that. We trust the scholarship that went into that. I don't have to, some people will say, I don't have to know the Greek, and I'm not going to put the time into the Hebrew, so we'll trust that. And so then we get to the point where we start translating it into more modern language. Sandy.
I think another advantage would be is, for me personally, is it's easier to understand, and therefore I think it's easier for it to be influential in my life.
Yeah. Yeah, what good is it if we can't figure out what it means? And,
Apply it.
yeah, and that's one thing, that's what a meaning for meaning translation, it tries to, give you the equivalent meaning from the original language. Let's see, the only well, there are a number of disadvantages, but the only one I'm gonna really focus on is it's easy when you're doing a meaning for meaning translation to then move into a paraphrase, where you're starting to interpret the passage while you're translating it. And that's, you're kind of doing that anyway, but we try to keep that at a minimum.
Thought for thought is interesting, because they were beginning to do this in the late 1800s and well to the early 20th century, things you don't see much in the general knowledge. When you go back and read them, they're stale, they don't fit the modern language. So one of the disadvantages, you have to update these, because the examples they're using are common in the mid-20th century would not be so common today.
Yeah.
So I think publishers have an advantage with this, because they're gonna have refreshes about every 20 years.
An updated edition.
Updated edition.
And we've seen that. I put on this board the Revised Standard Version, that was 52. The new RSV, New Revised Standard Version, 89. And then the NRSV UE Updated Edition, 2023. So, every 30, 40 years, this happened. And if they don't change the letter, we've seen updates in the NIV. So when you're reading the NIV, are you reading, what is it, the 83 or 84, whatever, or the 2011 edition? So, this is what's going to happen. So we're going to keep updating the languages. It is hard to keep track of it, but at the same time, we want to be reading something that's updating, and as Sandy said, it's easier to apply to this today.
Christina Booker.
Yeah.
In our ladies' Tuesday morning Bible study, she talks about the poetry of the King James. I was thinking, lose the poetry of the reading with the more modern translations. Because I'm not big on poetry, but it's just the language, how the language flows
Well,
and the,
but the poetry of the King James or the poetry of the Hebrew?
I'm not sure about that.
Yeah, I
I
know,
took it
no.
to King James.
Yeah, and the reason I asked that question is the King James is one great advantage of the King James version is that it is very poetic.
Mhm.
I mean, we did a good job in expressing poetry, but, you know, we do know some things now that we didn't know then, so, you know, just one example, yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death.
Mhm.
Well, when the King James readers came to, shadow of death, they thought that was two words. It's one word, means deep darkness. So, yea, they'll walk through the valley of deep darkness. It doesn't mean shadow. It means deep darkness. Now, shadow of death, if you hear that long enough, that's poetic. It has a poetic ring to it. You like that. And then for the newer translations to come along and take that out, then, you know, you don't like that. So I think that's kind of what, Chris is, getting at is, you know, we do, when we update, translations, because in this case, the King James got it wrong. I hate to say that, but that's the case. And then you had the King James version from 1611, definitely from 1769 up until what, the early, 1901 with, ASV, American Standard Version. And, this King James was pretty much it. And then newer translations came along. What's that one in Psalm 23 about, and we talked about it in class about still waters. And then, well, the Hebrew really means restful waters, not, waters of rest, not so much still. And, so
So is it poetic or just familiar and gives us comfort?
there you go. Yeah, that's a good question.
I think it was Gene Moyer too, who referred to that, the poetry of certain passages.
Yeah. And, you know, I go to Psalm 23 because that's the one we hear the most. We hear it in sermons at funerals. That's probably one of the most quoted scripture in my mind in movies, you know, especially if there's a death. You'll hear it in funerals, but, let's say someone, I remember a scene, I can't remember what movie it was, but, someone comes, it's World War II, and the messenger comes, and everyone knows it's a death. Someone has died, and they start going, and finally they go to this family, and then, and they break down, they start crying, and the pastors hear like this, yea, they'll walk through the valley, and just quoting Psalm 23. You've seen movies like this, right? And it's a very popular passage. Okay, thought for thought translation.
But David, just one more thing. I'd love to see sometime an example of the update of a certain version. What did they actually change in order to update that version?
Okay, we can do that, especially with the new, because this is the updated version, but I have the new RSV. And I can come up with some
Okay.
examples
We
before we
talked about
close.
that yesterday. Do you
Yeah.
remember that? Can you give her some of the examples we talked
I
about?
think you don't need to do that now. You
Yeah.
can save that for.
Yeah, we'll do it. Some of it has to do with pronouns, some of it has to do, and we talked about it in this class with Paul. It had to do with,
Is it more than what Joe said, just to keep the publisher busy?
well, yeah, I mean, there are, I mean, yeah, they wouldn't go through this, just, in fact, if you read the preface, I can I'll do that before I come up with some examples, because preface will tell you what the focus of their
Okay.
updated philosophy or agenda was, yeah. They just don't say, oh, we're gonna update it because it needs to be updated. They update it because,
Joe's thinking, I
Yeah,
can see his rules.
you'll
chart.
find online for the NIV, the ESV, and I think even an NLT, when they do an update, they'll actually give you a list of all the changes, so check one that has been updated recently, you'll see that on HCJ, or Holman Christian Standard Bible versus the Christian Standard Bible, you'll see that online.
and, I may come up with a handout if it's easy to do, some translation. What were those, NIV?
NIV, NET, I'm sorry, not NIV,
NLT.
NLT, the ESV, and the HCSB to the CSB.
ESV did the RSV, right? ESV did the RSV, right?
ESB has done, and in fact, they're having a lot of turmoil right now. People are not liking the changes that ESB is ready to make
Oh,
this year.
well, we'll see about that. Okay, we're about out of time, so what we're gonna do next week is we'll just go real quickly over the thought for thought translation, and then we'll look at what the New Living Translation does with Matthew 1:18. I think you'll find that very interesting. So, you'll see we are 10:15. Okay, have a good worship morning. Thank you, David. Yeah, you're welcome. See you next time.
I wanna make one correction about, Paul, that was governor, he was in charge of the Philadelphia school. I thought he was in eastern area, and I assumed it was New Jersey. He was in charge of the post, Civil War Reconstruction era school revising in Louisiana. And then when the US came to Puerto Rico, he was sent down to be in charge of the education system in Puerto Rico. And then Philadelphia.
Okay. Well, you said that a couple weeks ago.
Yeah. Take the bear falls witness.
I know you do. But that goes with, speaking. Probably, you know.
There was a man.